Hi and welcome to the Machine Ethics Podcast. This week we have some audio issues as we're sat with Sam Kinsley in a cafe in Bristol, so it's a little bit loud, but bear with us. Sam is from the University of Exeter and he's got insights coming from art, geography, Silicon Valley research, storytelling, and his own research into technology, AI and other subjects. Hope you enjoy. So, thanks Sam for meeting me in this cafe close to Christmas. Thanks for spending your time to come down to Bristol and talk to us on the podcast. If you could introduce yourself very briefly with what you're doing at Exeter.
Okay, yeah, I'm a lecturer in human geography. I have quite an interdisciplinary background, so most of my work is concerned with technology in various ways. I'm basically a failed artist who became a social scientist. My first degree was in digital art, and then I was a web developer, and then I got funding to go back to university, and I basically pursued a line of thinking about the ways in which we tell stories about the future around technology. And so that naturally, in many ways, led to me doing fieldwork in Silicon Valley. So that's what my PhD research was about, and I've had funding to do a bit of work around those themes since. But I guess it kind of broadened out into then thinking about, so how do you tell stories about technology as such? What is a technology? And why might that be of interest to geographers? So mostly that's then about, so how is it that we think about technology in relation to how we experience space and place? And I guess I've thought about that in two or three distinct ways. One is the sort of innovation practices, so that stems on the PhD work. Another is essentially thinking about the ways in which what we might colloquially think about as surveillance, but also the ways in which various kinds of data are captured about us and then used to govern us, to advertise to us, and various other kinds of things, and how that kind of constitutes particular understandings of space and place, and how we might think about the governance of that and the politics of that. And then finally, thinking about sort of much more micro scales of thinking about the body and how that relates to the kind of intimate experience of prosthesis, or the ways in which we add things onto ourselves in various kinds of ways as a kind of technological experience, and what that means again to space, place and identity basically.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot in there actually, considering you're coming from the geography's kind of not background necessarily, but the department you're situated in. It sounds like you're kind of picking on lots of threads from lots of different kind of directions, all to do with technology, but to do with social science and politics of personal data and all that sort of stuff, and also maybe looking at some of the technical implementations and also kind of the infrastructure as well, especially with space and place kind of infrastructure and how we move around a space, whether it's cars or walking, and how we interact, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, precisely. And I guess geography has been variously concerned with the things that we mostly mean colloquially by technology. So more often than not, actually, that's devices that mediate in various kinds of ways. So it's the kinds of devices that you and I have in front of us and in our pockets right now.
Yep.
The device that's recording us, and then the kinds of infrastructures that facilitate how those devices function.
Yeah.
But of course, the cup that holds my coffee in front of me is also a technology,
It's a mediator of your coffee.
Up to a point. I guess also it's an entity of non-relation insofar as it doesn't let the coffee go.
Yeah.
So
it's quite a broad definition.
Yeah, and geography takes very specific bits. And I guess coming from a more humanities background, I bring other aspects back into the conversation. Perhaps I'm not alone in that. I'm not claiming any amazing novelty, so geography is really interesting as a discipline to house yourself in because it's so broad. So on the one hand, I've got colleagues who are glaciologists, and on the other hand, I've got colleagues who are experiment with artistic practices. They actually engage in artistic practice themselves, and I've got colleagues who are activists. So you can. There's a kind of facetious answer to what is geography that we often teach into the first year, which is geography is what geographers do. And so as a geographer, what I do is geography. I know that sounds slightly nonsensical, but it does sort of make sense.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like an artist as well. It's like if you're an artist and you make art, it's art. It doesn't really matter what the art is that you're making, by virtue of being an artist.
Quite.
That's really fascinating. I'm not sure I've had contact with that many geographers, and that many geographers who are that kind of progressive, but also interesting in other lots of different things, I guess. Lots of different disciplines that come into what seems like your work, specifically with space and place and mediation, but also having those people around you to talk to you about glaciers and activism is probably very useful, right?
Yeah. So for example, some of my colleagues actively use some of the technologies that one might be skeptical of in their deployment in other arenas. So, for example, I have colleagues who use drones, but they're not using drones to surveil people or do anything weird. They're doing drones to they're using drones to determine, the depth of an ice sheet. Or to do particular kinds of very high resolution mapping and that kind of stuff. So there's some really interesting kinds of crossover.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly academia is not so readily regimented. It might appear to be in the ways in which we communicate what we do.
Yeah.
Like on websites and in various kinds of ways, the ways in which we publish, for example. But actually, the kind of everyday stuff is often quite, open and interdisciplinary in various sorts of ways.
So the first question I usually ask everyone who comes onto the podcast is, what is artificial intelligence?
Right.
To you, I mean.
What's an right? It's a discourse. It's a way in which different kinds of people tell stories, more or less about themselves through a kind of refraction of the machine. So you can think about, back to short stories in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century by people like E.M. Forster and H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
I think Forster's The Machine Stops is a really kind of interesting sort of take on these kinds of things. It more or less begins to tell the kinds of stories that we're familiar with now about particular kinds of extra-human agency of something that is a machine. That becomes a kind of quasi-religious entity, which, if you look at the work of people like Kurzweil or various other kinds of people, it does definitely takes on that kind of patina.
Pseudo-religious kind of.
But I think at the same time, of course, it's a whole field of inquiry. There's a whole load of people who are doing research, so it's a set of endeavours that some of those people are more or less happy about calling it AI.
Yep.
You know, hence you get phrases like machine learning get used an awful lot more, and
Yep.
it's another instance of one of the stories we tell about techne or technics, the affordances of being a technical being.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I think AI tells us more about the ways in which we conceive of our own intelligence and ideas of mind and various other kinds of things than it does about anything that we might actually make.
That's it's a really interesting point, because what you're basically saying is AI's endeavour to learn more about us through implementing and researching and making things, and whether the end point of the making things is, singularity, whatever shape it could formulate itself in, we're actually learning more about ourselves in that kind of endeavour, really. Or along the way, we're learning a lot about ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's the most charitable version.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting. Charlie Stross, in one of the openings of his novels, do you know Charles Stross is a science fiction writer, British science fiction writer, and he uses a quote from somebody obscure right at the beginning of one of his books, where it's something along the lines of, being interested in artificial intelligence is a bit like asking the question of how a submarine swims or how an aeroplane flies.
Yeah.
You're eliding two kind of sets of ideas. We're capable of creating machines that fly, but they don't flap wings. They do something very different.
Yeah,
and a submarine is more than capable of moving through the water, but it's not a fish.
It doesn't swim,
No.
for instance. Yeah.
So the kinds of the care we might need to take about the stories we tell around what it is that we mean by artificial intelligence, and if we wrap those two words in scare quotes, is then about precisely attending to the ways in which we think about ourselves, and we think about how we understand our own intelligence and what it is that we want to get out of the world.
Yeah.
That's probably quite a humanist way of addressing it.
Yeah.
I don't think there's much wrong with that.
That's fine. I mean, if that's what your opinion is, then that's great.
I guess I don't really have a fixed opinion, to be honest. I think it's an interesting set of debates, an interesting set of ideas with and through which we can ask questions.
Yep. Cool. Well, the big one out of the way. I noticed that you had an award-winning piece of an article that you wrote called "The Matter of Virtual Geographies." Could you briefly elaborate on that? What's that paper about?
That paper's about the ways in which we tell stories about space and mediation, up to a point, digital mediation. So it's about the ways in which we use that word virtual, and the sense in which, in lots of different domains, so you can think about the kind of popular understandings of governance, how we understand what we mean by the internet, how we understand mobile phones, how we understand all sorts of different kinds of devices and how they get governed and how they kind of produce different kinds of spatial experience is wrapped up with a kind of elision, which is an elision of materiality. So there's a sense in which it becomes perfectly acceptable to talk about things as being the virtual as being immaterial in various kinds of ways. And of course that gets wrapped up into much bigger stories, longer and much more enduring stories about how we understand what is real. So you often get distinctions between the virtual and the real, and we'll wrap those two things in scare quotes as well. So what does that mean? So it means that you can, in some senses, take the virtual less seriously, or decide that it matters less, that it might be less of lesser ethical import. and that in some ways it becomes excusable to do things in spaces that you perceive to be somehow separate. So a lot of the writing that emerges from the birth of the internet onwards begins to carve out a kind of separate electronic mediated domain, and that draws on all sorts of ideas about space that geographers have then gone on to had already been problematizing in different kinds of ways.
Yeah.
So the kinds of ideas about Cartesian extension, space as a box, XYZ axis, that you then somehow sort of add an additional layer to, becomes quite problematic, because of course, especially once we have the devices again that we've got in front of us, it's not clear where that layering is taking place, or where one layer starts and stops, and then how agency might play out between those layerings. So of course actually it becomes much more about forms of relationality, how we with our devices constitute relations that then might be perceived as different kinds of spatial experience. So you can think about the ways in which a sense of distance might be mediated through a mobile phone.
Yep.
So you get off the train and you ring the person that you're about to see, and you say, train was a couple of minutes late, but no worries, I'll be there in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you sort of bridged a sense of distance in a particular way, and then affords a particular phenomenological closeness, a sense of closeness, subjective sense of closeness that belies the fact that, of course, you are still topographically
very far away.
Distant.
Yeah.
And of course, also that signal might have travelled a significant distance if you were to measure how the electronic signal may have travelled through the infrastructure and so on.
Yeah.
So actually, and that's a very material thing. For example, your phone might have, if we return to this made-up conversation on the phone, the signal might have gone a bit weird during that phone call, and that might have been about the literal qualities of the atmosphere surrounding you, the sense in which it's actually quite a muggy day. So there's a lot more water vapour, which mediates how the signal can pass through the air. And so it might not have gone to the closest cell tower, it might have ended up going to a different one. And there might have been a bit of lag, or it might have been a bit crackly. So something about the quality of that connection, both literal electronic connection and a sense of connection between us, is going to be affected by the ways in which the material of the air actually interferes with or has something to do with your conversation. So the paper was essentially about bringing those ideas into a more explicit conversation in geography, and thinking about that through, in particular, through the work of a French philosopher called Bernard Stiegler. And he uses this idea of transduction, which I think can be quite helpful about thinking about that kind of slippery nature of what some people might think of as quite ephemeral forms of relation that we were talking about in relation to that phone conversation. And essentially what transduction allows us to think, is the kind of temporariness of how those forms of relation get forged and then may dissipate, and how that is what gets referred to as kind of metastable. They exist for a particular period of time, they're on a threshold, but something changes and they transform into something else. So in many ways, the relationship between the human and the technical is always kind of being modulated by the different transfers of agency, different transfers of energy, all sorts of kinds of forces that allow those forms of relationality to kind of congeal for a moment, for want of a better word, and then kind of they'll just transform into something else.
Yeah. That sounds like an impossible situation.
What?
So you've just described the layering up of all these different things, the congealing of them together, and then the dispersion, the transduction of these things that are almost flippant and ethereal. Certain layers of these things, right? How can you even? How useful is that? What is the end product of thinking in that way? Because it seems like it's almost too much to think about.
Yeah, there definitely is a sense in which it is an excessive understanding of reality, but then lots of people would argue that precisely is what it is to be real. I guess what it allows is a particular way of forming a kind of critical hook into how we can create particular kinds of descriptions and analyses of how technologies work. And it's most of the way in which theory matters in my work is about the ways in which concepts can do some work for us. So the ways in which they have some kind of purchase in how we can ask questions about the kinds of phenomena that we're interested in studying. As a social scientist, it tends to be that what we do is we go out and talk about stuff, especially people, perform different kinds of analyses with and about those phenomena, because they're necessary participants in our analysis. And then thinking about the ways in which that then produces more questions or produces productive ways of kind of thinking about the world. So what transduction does is perhaps breaks out of some slightly more clunky or mechanistic thinking that allows us precisely to think about space and place in a more nuanced way in relation to technology. Right. So it's about sort of slightly undoing that sense of distanciation of the virtual or the digital or whatever you want to call it as some kind of ethereal realm, and actually giving it bite, giving it matter again in our descriptions. And so on the one hand, that might actually be a fundamentally ethical endeavour, insofar as what it means is that we're attending precisely to how those materialities get organised, how it is they can come to be, so how they get manufactured, what that involves, the fact that it may well involve all sorts of conflict minerals, for example, and that actually the only ways in which a lot of our devices can function is precisely through some quite ethically questionable socioeconomic practices of manufacture, from the actual mining of rare earth metals, to the kinds of manufacturing practice that various kinds of large electronics companies might engage in. So it's actually sort of being able to you can't ever tell the whole story, of course you can't.
Sure.
But it's about being able to provide what I was talking about earlier, those kind of conceptual hooks into those various kinds of phenomena, so that you can begin to unpack that story differently.
Have you heard of a philosopher called Henry Bergson?
Yes.
So he has this idea of the intuition, which is similar but not as useful in this manner, I guess, not as specific, but in a similar way you're trying to kind of unfold the reality of what the thing is, or what the situation is, by immersing yourself in the possibilities and the past at the same time. Which is one of those really interesting things that I read and discovered at the time, and it seems like a similar sort of deal where you're trying to, you know that it's almost an impossible dream, but you're trying as much as you can to bring together these separate layers that get about the same event or the same thing, same physical thing, same digital thing, all in one place, and keep that in your mind, or keep that wherever.
Yeah.
In that way, kind of, how do you represent those sorts of phenomena?
Another member of our conversation.
That's right. I totally agree. How do you bring those things, those separate geographies, together and make a representation?
I guess by recognising they're not separate.
Sure.
And the various ways in which... So, all ethnographic work is necessarily about telling particular kinds of stories.
Yeah.
It's, in that sense, it's different.
So you're a storyteller?
Yeah, up to a point, yeah.
Okay.
But I don't engage in bad creative writing, I hope.
Okay, sure.
So yeah, it's about providing different accounts of the aspects of the phenomena that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
So the data that you gather, however you might, in the broader sense we might conceive of the idea of data, necessarily are going to exceed the descriptive capacities that you have for a given project. So you end up writing in a particular way about particular aspects because you've asked particular kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. And you may come back and ask different kinds of questions of the same data later, or you may not. So it might be that those are just projects that you never quite crystallise. I guess it's about embracing that and understanding that if you do hold to that kind of broadly kind of excessive understanding of reality, that it kind of almost is too much to describe, that you're just honest about that, and then honest about how it is that you pick the kinds of stories that you're telling.
Yep.
So for example, Bergson does get picked up by a lot of sort of later 20th century philosophers precisely because of the ways in which he kind of draws on a particular sense of excess, and the ways in which he kind of refracts that as, of course, through recall. It's about memory, it's about ways in which we then recall, and then there's different ways in which that gets wrapped up in how we might understand technology and the sense in which from the moment we start making marks in clay tablets onwards, where we're using a prosthetic sense of memory, we're able to materially externalize thought up to a point, fix it in particular kinds of ways, and then forget it and come back to it.
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of like an acceptance of our own outsourcing of memory and ability and the excess of knowledge from the antiquity basically onwards.
Yeah.
Cool, groovy. In what way, Sam, do you find AI and artificial kind of learning and that sort of, whether it be genetic algorithms or machine learning algorithms and neural networks and things like this, which are very popular and in the news a lot at the moment, to do with all sorts of different technologies and being imbued in everything at the moment. In what ways are you seeing that affect what kind of area of study is, or kind of come into the way you're looking at the mediation of our world, I guess.
Well, I guess all the way through our conversation I've been talking about how I'm interested in how people tell stories about technology, and how I then might tell stories about technology, because of course I'm not at a distance from any of this. So my immediate response to your question would be, isn't it interesting that actually we don't just stop with a kind of description about how these technologies may or may not work and their limits. Actually what happens is people run off down the road, either screaming and worried about Terminator, or pick another dystopian science fiction story, or I think it's we're racing headlong towards the singularity. It's always taken to an extreme in various kinds of ways, and I guess the thing that then becomes interesting to propose is a slowing down of how we tell those stories, and to think a little bit more critically, and I don't mean necessarily negatively, I just mean how we ask more nuanced questions about, so, well, what do the people who are making these things think they're doing?
Yeah, sure.
How is it that the things that they make provide particular kinds of affordances or not? How do they break? How do they get repurposed, reimagined, reused, and then how do they get translated through popular culture? Because, like you've been suggesting, there's an enormous amount of sort of popular writing about these kinds of things. So, in that sense, you could, there's all sorts of research projects that no doubt are happening precisely about the kinds of not quite fiction but also not quite fact that are being kind of related about how AI or different flavours of algorithm, another word which I find quite problematic, in
what way do you find that problematic?
I guess because it's used as a catch-all, so it gets used to hide other things, either purposefully or not. So we have a much bigger vocabulary for thinking about the phenomena that get labelled by the word algorithm. So we might think about program, protocol, routine, device, all sorts of other kinds of things that maybe get at some of the nuance that we might want to actually open out rather than black box with the word algorithm. Sure. So for example, we often hear phrases like Google's algorithm or Facebook's algorithm that singularizes this idea of there's this one thing, which of course is essentially saying Google and Facebook do magic. Right? Yeah. They're not saying that actually these are complex organizations. They engage in all sorts of kinds of work that have different kinds of infrastructures upon which they're contingent, and then are profoundly wrapped up with different forms of human in scare quotes endeavour, insofar as we might separate out the fleshy sacks that we walk around as. Yeah. Which again is a problematic distinction.
Yeah, or wetware.
Yes, that's a horrible. That makes me cringe. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think when people say algorithm to me, I mean, I find artificial intelligence or AI as similarly problematic because it can mean lots of different things, and it's becoming more synonymous with neural networks and stuff like that, which is fine, but it's not the whole research plethora of artificial intelligence at all. It's just a certain subset. Whereas algorithms, in my head, I always see the Google page rank algorithm, because that is definitely a singular algorithm. You could write it out as a mathematical equation, and it just so happens that equation gets inputs and outputs, and that is manifest in a computer program. And it's, you could probably write it out and it wouldn't be too large, but that is a part of this larger machine, which effectively in Google, which is many more algorithms or kind of smaller functions that all build this huge Goliath almost. So just a bit of digging into that. And
there's been all sorts of arguments about definition.
Sure.
And again, that's political. That's about saying who has the authority to name things in various kinds of ways. I guess I'm less interested in the authority of naming. So I'm not saying anything's wrong.
Yes.
Right?
You sure you wouldn't want a Kinsley algorithm?
No.
No?
I'm pretty sure I wouldn't. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
There's various kinds of authority of sort of naming stuff, but maybe one of the interesting things to do, maybe because I'm just a bit contrarian,
sure,
is to kind of pick out and pick apart how that authority is functioning. So that's when I talk about discourses. I guess that's what I mean. Is it's the ways in which people convene and construct and then perform a conversation in variously in text, orally, all sorts of ways. But then the ways in which that inherently has some kind of politics to it, because people are positioning themselves in different kinds of ways, and that means that our understanding flows in different kinds of ways and changes. And so some things might be hidden, some things might be played up. So Foucault, the French sort of social theorist Michel Foucault talks about discursive regimes. He's precisely talking about the ways in which these conversations take on a kind of power relation. So the ways in which people can kind of claim a sort of authority. So algorithm is, as a word and a concept, is a kind of interesting example of that. There's a way in which by invoking the idea of algorithm, you're assuming a particular kind of power because you're pointing at a particular phenomena and saying it's this. Where it might be actually what you're doing is not pointing at that phenomena, you're sort of hiding behind the concept to be able to hide other things.
Yeah, to make assertion in a different light or to misconstrue something else. Yeah. I was wondering. You mentioned Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Could you briefly tell us what research you were doing there?
Yeah, sure. So I spent 2 periods of time in 2008 and 2011 interviewing people who were variously involved in different, actually quite specific kinds of computing research and development, which was more or less solely concerned with corporate research and development labs. And the way in which they were engaged in the development of something that used to get called ubiquitous computing, possibly less so now. Yep. But the idea that computation disappears into the woodwork of everyday life is essentially what one of the first people to sort of name this stuff described it as. So a guy called Mark Weiser, who worked at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in the 80s and 90s, kind of wrote an article that got published in Scientific American in '91 called "The Computer for the 21st Century." And in that, interestingly, he uses a story. He literally tells a fictional story about a woman called Sal waking up and gives an account of her day. And in giving that account, he describes and brings in these ideas about how it's not about a specific device like the laptop that you have in front of you, but it's about lots and lots of different devices, a whole kind of ecosystem of devices whose computational power is sort of hidden away. It doesn't get in our way. He liked this idea of sort of calm computing. So, and I guess there's bigger themes around California of the kind of 70s and 80s that probably play into that, about a particular version of utopianism, a particular version of sort of hippie culture and all sorts of other things. And a fantastic book about that was written by a guy called Fred Turner at Stanford, called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, and he kind of unpicks that. Anyway, that's kind of like the background to essentially what I was doing, is asking people about the actual stuff that they're doing on a day-to-day basis when they're attempting to invent this extraordinary idea of ubiquitous computing, and how they then relate to an idea of a technological future, because everything that they're asked to do is essentially to think about a future and to try and anticipate particular worlds and kind of imagine those worlds in which the devices that they're creating might function. So what might the life of a user of your ubiquitous computing product look like? And of course we don't know, so they're having to engage in all sorts of different forms of...
But they must have ideas, right?
Yeah, and a lot of those are of course based on their own experience. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that most of these people are white middle class men. So the kinds of vision of the future very much are kind of culturally situated. But having said that, it kind of opens out interesting ways of asking questions about what the agency of our ideas about a technological future is, and the kinds of bigger stories that get used as part of that. So I became interested in the sense in which actually a lot of what they were doing was more or less political, not with a capital P, but with a little p, to think about the ways in which different kinds of competing visions of a given future get presented by different labs who are trying to present different ways of thinking about how particular kinds of tasks may or may not get performed, and how different aspects of our everyday lives may or may not be transformed or mediated through the technologies that they're creating. So on the one hand, you've very much got a kind of computation agency in the background in the Palo Alto Research Centre vision of the early 90s. Another project that I looked at was a project from HP Labs that was about 10 years later that gets referred to as Cool Town. Which is everything's got a web server in it. Is the premise? It's this idea that everything is addressable using the internet in different kinds of ways, and then you can kind of ask questions of it, and they can variously interrelate. And actually, then in versions of the story that get told of Cool Town, some of those things are much more about vying for your attention than the story that Mark Weiser tells about Sam. So there is an implicit ethics of interaction that is that plays out in these different kinds of stories.
Yeah, and that's informed by the cultural situation and their backgrounds and how they're thinking about the implementation of this cool town or whatever.
Yeah, and the kinds of institutional frameworks and different kinds of practices, sort of communities of practice that in which they're engaged. So the ways in which different people have ideas and bring them to the fore become more central characters to how they understand this particular version of a technological future. But it's also the ways in which, in most of these cases, the future is somehow a blank slate that can be written onto.
Yeah.
So you're unencumbered by the messy politics of the present. You can just project into this kind of, and that's pregnant in phrases like blue skies thinking.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is, of course, necessary. There are necessary levels of abstraction that we have to engage in. But it kind of becomes interesting when you're then trying to systematise that and turn it into a product.
Yes, sure. And the impact it has as a product, and unintended impacts and ethical impacts.
Yeah, and the kinds of clashes then, or the kinds of uncanny that can be produced in that, where you just kind of like, as a user, you might go, "Oh, that's a bit weird.
Yeah,
don't like that," or just say, "Actually, this is not how I think about the world. This is really unhelpful."
Yeah.
And that product then dies a death or whatever.
Yeah.
But of course, even before you get to it being in our hands, it's gone through all sorts of forms of translation through a corporate business division that is developing an idea into a product. And of course, a lot of these ideas don't ever actually get turned into products, so they remain as intellectual property, which you then kind of protect. And so you get these big corporate battles that, most people, who can blame them for not being interested? But there's an interesting kind of politics and ethics to how knowledge gets policed in R&D land.
Yes, yeah, especially in that land. I mean, I feel like in my mind there's the devolution of that kind of practice, where R&D as a discipline is becoming more innovation or kind of business, and R&D as a specific sector or like part of a business doesn't really exist anymore, except for in the larger institutions like Procter & Gamble and HP and places like this, where most of us are striving for innovation, but we don't actually do research and development because that's almost, the terminology is old rather than the practice of that terminology.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting. It's kind of like a trend that's...
I'd agree, and I think the differences I saw between 2008 and 2011 and then I'm in touch with some of those people now. Another 5 years on, none of those people are working in corporate labs anymore.
Right.
Or if they are, they're working in very different kinds of institutional setup.
Yeah.
So whereas a lot of people working for HP, IBM, Microsoft, Nokia, a lot of those people then went into startups or went into slightly smaller businesses. They kind of stepped sideways into other kinds of work. So they either became more apparently sort of business oriented, so it was about working towards the construction and creation of products.
Yep.
But actually it's still, the things that they were doing on a day-to-day basis were still quite similar. It's just they're taking in more of the of that kind of path from initial concept to beginning to produce prototypes and then kind of something that gets maybe turned into a product. So the kinds of business practices that people are engaging in are quite different, and the kinds of contexts that they occur in are very different.
Yeah, and smaller cycles as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Instead of all this testing.
I think that the future that is always just down the road, the horizon that operates at is quite elastic. It kind of stretches, it kind of boomerangs backwards and forwards. So when Weiser was working, he was talking maybe 10, 12, 15 years ahead. And then there are other contexts in which actually the furthest ahead that some people might be thinking is like 4 or 5 years. And that's contingent on all sorts of different kinds of pressures that occur in the kinds of business that are operating.
Do you... so I have 2 more questions.
Yeah, go on.
We end on a high, so before that one, is there anything that scares you about our technological future?
A lack of imagination.
Yeah? In what way?
Well, if we continue to tell the same stories that we're telling now,
and like Terminator and things like that.
and allow that to be the story, then we limit the possibilities.
So it's about changing the narrative culturally, the cultural narrative.
Yeah, and maybe including more people in that, in the creation of that narrative in various kinds of ways. So allowing more people into the story in different kinds of ways, I think, is probably a really important element.
So more diversity as well.
Yeah, I mean, so, rather than sort of reading the slightly more male and muscular visions of technological future that occur in certain versions of science fiction, maybe we should be reading more Ursula Le Guin.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe we should be reading more Afrofuturism, and maybe we should be attending to different and perhaps contrary stories, because that way there's more. Well, it produces a more exciting, more eclectic future that we might want to live in.
Well, maybe I should get you to send me a reading list after this, and I'll put it up on the site as well.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah. So I totally agree. I think one of the things, just a quick example, like Moon. Have you seen the film Moon? I think what Moon does really brilliantly is it has an AI character, and it plays on the fact that usually in films, in our cultural narrative, AI characters, artificial intelligences, are usually bad, or they play out in some sort of catastrophe. And in Moon, actually, it plays on that fact by creating this tension, but actually the AI is helpful throughout the film. And the tension isn't actually with that character at all. It's with the circumstance and humanity's what humanity has done in that circumstance. So I find that really funny that tension only exists because our narrative is so negative against these things currently. And I also believe, I presume as you do, that we can kind of change our future through these cultural narratives, these cultural artifacts. And if we start thinking positively about them, hopefully, people will make good things and have a different view on how these things can operate and exist and that sort of thing.
There's one quote that gets used a lot and is quite divisive, and it comes from Alan Kay, another person who works at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Centre. He talks about the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And a lot of people kind of overcode that quote with the idea that essentially that this is about a kind of capturing the futures in particular kinds of ways, and that it represents some kind of corporate capitalist ideology.
Sure.
But there is perhaps a more forgiving interpretation, which is to say, well, actually, the agency lies with all of us in various kinds of ways. And so, by being inventive, we can perhaps have different and better.
Being inventive, just creating new narratives, participating in different ways, creating conversation, discourse. These are all participatory areas, arenas.
So an example of this is a project I was involved in as part of the European Capital of Culture in 2012, which was in Guimarães in Portugal.
Right.
And we did some workshops with any interested citizen, anybody who wanted to turn up. It was a free workshop, and we began to kind of try and produce particular kinds of stories and scenarios about the ways in which they thought technology might help in their everyday lives. And then, rather than kind of fetishize the shiny kind of objects and create them in CGI or anything, we made props out of cardboard.
Sure.
So then what it kind of focused on is precisely the kind of ideas and the kind of inventive agency of those workshop scenarios. So what it does is produce a kind of sense in which actually it's about the ideal, it's not about the shiny object. So one thing that the people were really interested in was this idea of taking on a collective responsibility for one another's health. So rather than have a device that is kind of constantly checking on you and reporting your vital statistics back to some centralized server, and then the emergency services being called automatically. Actually, what it was is that there were sensors built into the street furniture in this vision, and they would then alert people who happen to be close by. Our model of how this works suggests this person might be in trouble, so please can you help? And so then it was your responsibility as a kind of fellow citizen to check this person was okay. So it's a kind of really interesting sort of ethical stance that was being taken in the interpretation of what a technological future might look like.
That's really interesting. I think we've already kind of headed in that direction, but what is it that excites you about the future, or these future visions?
That's an interesting... I find that quite a difficult question to answer. Not because I'm horribly pessimistic, but because I find the visions themselves interesting objects of study, but not necessarily things that I want to particularly buy into.
Sure.
Especially. So I'm interested in... I'm quite excited by the ways in which the kind of vernacular practices of video, the ways in which we all have devices on our person most of the time, through which we can create sort of whimsical or serious visions of the future quite quickly and relatively straightforwardly, so that actually it's a kind of pluralizing of at least the potential for people to be able to tell convincing stories about the kinds of people they want to be, the kinds of world they want to live in. So I guess it's that extension and expansion of kind of the capacity to be able to tell a story about the future that I find relatively hopeful.
Cool. Well, thanks, Sam, for joining us on the podcast today, and we'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, cheers.